So, welcome listeners, welcome to Kyle and Cody's Cult Cinema Cast. This week we got a special episode introducing our, our new friend actually. I was going to say old friend, but we've we've only know each other. We've only really talked for 30 minutes. Marcus Hart, who some of you guys will have seen. We did talk to with his friend Yannick a while back. And he is involved with his movie Mondo Hollywoodland. Marcus, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
No, thank you guys. I'm happy to be here. Yannick, he says good things about you guys. He had a good time on this podcast, so immediately he was like, "Why don't you go on there?" Because we do have Mondo Hollywoodland coming to streaming in Canada on Amazon. So it'll be available in Canada. It's already available in the United States. I think some other territories as well. But my involvement with the film, Yannick's the director, and he co-wrote the film along with myself and Chris Blim, who's also the star of the movie. He plays Boyle, our favorite friend in the blonde hair and cowboy hat. I think one of the most interesting things and why I thought I could kind of come on and talk to you guys about, for those who are curious, is this film had an interesting and kind of long gestation process. And I mean, it's had a long life after we concluded shooting, because the shoot goes all the way back to 2018. But even before that, I got first involved with this project probably either late 2015 or early 2016, like that long ago. And it probably, it was probably more like mid 2016 actually. And basically, here's how it started. It was really interesting. Yannick, who I actually live with, he's my roommate as well. If you guys didn't know that.
No.
Yeah, no. So him and I have known each other a long time. We went to school together back in the East Coast, and he moved out here first, and then I moved out here a few years after him. But we've both been out here for a long time now, and kind of working together on projects. And I know you guys have this independent film focus, so it's like one of those things where there's a lot of different ways to kind of not only get into that, but I think the more important part is to stay into that. So Yannick's the type of guy who tries a lot of different things, right? And he's got his producing, but he's also got his scripts that he's developing. And when it comes to directing, which is the kind of the hardest thing to do, because you either get hired or you find a way to hire yourself, right? And even finding a way to hire yourself, depending on what the budget is, what the intention is, and kind of what type of film you're really making and how you're going to make it, can be a complicated thing. So I think around that time, 2016 going into 2017, he was looking at a few different things he could develop that he felt like I could just shoot this myself. Like I can just go out with a camera, maybe put together a small budget and shoot it. And he had a few different things that were not Mondo. At the same time, he became a little bit interested in virtual reality, like VR, and the potential for VR filming. And so he had been talking to me a little bit about this. He was talking about investing in like what was at the time like a very cheap VR camera rig. Ironically, I feel like now phones can basically do exactly what this camera did. He was talking about that, and he just was like, I have this idea of kind of just capturing Hollywood in VR. And almost, I don't know if it was the exact same conversation, pretty quickly after that, he mentioned to me, like, I kind of want to see this as potentially a modern version in VR at the time, a modern version in VR of the cult film Mondo Hollywood. Now, I'm assuming Yannick talked to you guys a little bit about this.
Mm-hmm.
He went on, but there's a film from the late 60s called Mondo Hollywood, and it's essentially like I actually first saw the film when Paul Thomas Anderson, who I was actually just at a screening for his new movie Licorice Pizza last night, which is very cool, and I'm a big fan of that film. I can tell your listeners that, but I'm just a big Paul Thomas Anderson stan anyways. It's like he's he's probably my second favorite filmmaker, but he made my favorite movie of all time. So I was very excited about this, and so anytime there's anything that comes up in Hollywood that we're able to get access to related to him, I make it my like life's mission to go. And this was actually the first time this happened. He was coming to the AFI for the AFI Fest, and they were going to do the first LA screenings of what at the time, this is 2014, his new film Inherent Vice. And when he talked to the programmers at the AFI, he was like, I want to screen one of my influences, and this is a film that not a lot of people know about. It's a very small cult film that kind of got lost in the shuffle, but he was taking a lot of inspiration from other, quote, Mondo movies like the films of Robert Downey Sr., like Putney Swope and Glucer's Palace, and a bit of John Waters in there. And he was like, but nobody's ever heard of this. Very few people have ever heard of this movie called Mondo Hollywood. And so he screened the film as a part of like a 2-day event. They screened Mondo Hollywood one night, and then they screened Inherent Vice the other night. So I had tickets to go to both nights. Originally, Yannick was actually supposed to come, but he couldn't make it that night through a twist of fate. So I saw the film, and I was like immediately like telling him all about it. Like, dude, this movie's crazy. It's like, it's kind of like it's what today you would call a quote mockumentary. But the reason I'm saying you would call it today that is that it's a little bit different intention. Like, I think what people think of as modern mockumentary kind of came more out of this is Spinal Tap, like Christopher Guest stuff, where it's like you get improv performers to basically pretend like they're real people in a documentary, whereas this was more like we're kind of creating a film that is like using aspects of realities with slight elements of fiction, but we're shooting it in this what was then kind of like a newer thing of verite handheld style, and kind of giving it the feel and texture of a documentary. But it's something in between that, and we're leaning into like this kind of weird sensationalist, like the censors can't kind of stop us look at things. So that was like the idea of Mondo Hollywood. You have like some there was like a heir to a fortune who just wants to be a surfer. There's like some weird old lady. It's been years since I've actually seen the original film. But anyway, fast forward like 3 years. Now Yannick's talking about this VR project, and he's like, I want this to be the modern version of that. And I think we should call it Mondo Hollywoodland. And I'm going to talk to the director of that film and kind of get his blessing to do this, which he did. And I would say his name, but unfortunately his name escapes me at the moment. But people look it up. Look up Mondo Hollywood, the original, and you'll find out all that information. Back at that AFI Fest, Paul Thomas Anderson did like a really cool Q&A with the filmmakers. I imagine it was a big treat for all involved, including me. I think I still have the recording on my phone, shot on like 5 iPhones ago, saved something. So hard to dig through all that stuff. But yeah, so Yannick came to me, and at first he just like kind of like the way it is, because like I said, I live with him, is like he'll pitch me ideas all the time, and it's not necessarily like I want you to come on and work on this. It's usually kind of just more like, hey, I'm trying something out, like you're a good springboard to talk about stuff with, and we have a relationship where it's like there's not really any sort of real worry that like, oh, I gave you this idea. It's not like that. So it's just like it's kind of like a free-flowing conversation to kind of give reaction and feedback and response, right? And it's also kind of an extension of just the work of Assembly Line Entertainment. Like this, our home is like the office away from the office, you know? So, you know, we were talking about it, and I think not too long after that, at some point in 2017, he was like, I think it'd be cool if, because he was busy with other projects trying to develop these other things as potentially the thing he would shoot. Because I think at the time when he's thinking of Mondo Hollywoodland as this VR thing, he's not exactly sure how it's going to work as a quote film yet. Like the book had not really been written on that. In some ways, it still hasn't. So he was like, all right, maybe you could figure it out. You're pretty crafty with screenwriting, because that's kind of my reputation, at least around our circle, is like I'm kind of the screenwriting guru, which I take a lot of pride in that. I'm not trying to brag about myself. It's just the fact that like I take a lot of pride in being someone that people depend on to kind of know how to crack a story, or how to fix a problem in a story, or how to kind of pinpoint what an issue with the story is, right? So I was like, okay, that sounds like it could be a fun experiment. And like one of the earliest things we talked about was narration, because I think the idea was like, oh, I'll just go plant this little VR camera I have around different spots in Hollywood. So it'll just be kind of like footage. It'll almost be like, almost more of like an art installation. You know, like I think the early idea was it was going to be very experimental. It's going to be like, oh, you're in this bar, you're in Musso and Frank's, you're wherever, and you can kind of just get a 360 panorama because it's VR of everything going on in there. So how do you make that experience narrative, or if not narrative, at least like have something that feels like something's being given to you? And so the solution was, why don't we have this narrator? Now, when I started talking to him about what that should be and could be, I was kind of like, well, if it's going to be VR, meaning like the person, say, putting on a headset and they're kind of just in the middle of this world, the whole nature of VR to me, to my mind, I don't have that much experience with it, but it's like, it's kind of like an out-of-body experience. It's kind of like you're existing sort of somewhere between, like, you know, you don't have, like, you're like almost looking at the world, but you have no shape, you have no form. And that made me think of, you know, concepts that I sometimes think about in my mind, whether it's because of sci-fi or other things I read. Like, it's kind of like you're in the fifth dimension. Like, right? You have your 3 dimensions of space, then you have time, and then there's something even above that that can kind of supersede all that. So I was like, oh, the narrator should be the man from the fifth dimension. And I think at that point, Yannick was like, I want him to have the voice of James Mason. Because James Mason, for those who don't know, classic Hollywood actor, in the film Lolita. He gave a performance actually in the film with Paul Newman, The Verdict, after he was an older gentleman. He was in a lot of classic Hollywood films, and he's known for having like a very pronounced, what they call mid-Atlantic accent, like even more than Cary Grant. Like it's basically British at that point. I think he actually, I could be wrong, but I think he's from England. Sorry if that's not correct. But yeah, so James Mason is known for this very particular voice. And at the time, I think Yannick and I were he's always been a fan of James Mason and a fan of that voice. Like, he does an impression of it himself, actually. But we were really partial to Bill Hader of SNL fame. His impression of James Mason. Like, he has this great impression of, like, a box of dare nuts. Like he just, like, talks about, like, random things as James Mason. He's like, oh, I see. Like, this this sort of kind of like weird, out of like too posh for the rest of the world kind of point of view. And so we had a lot of fun with that. So it was like, okay, that was basically the task. So what I started with was write something that will sound good in James Mason's voice, that'll be like a fifth dimensional perspective, that'll be commenting on the sort of, quote, weird sights of Hollywood in VR. So where that kind of led to was, I was like, okay, I started to just try to write sort of dollar store, you know, not to equip as a dollar store philosophy about the nature of Hollywood. And, you know, as I was working on it, I was still engaging in that conversation with Yannick about what I was doing, or like what I thought was good about it. I think I sent him some early pages, and like, you can go to the final film now. That first sort of narration you hear when they're swooping over the desert and all that, like a lot of that is more or less straight from the first draft that I ever wrote of this, like going back to like 2017. So like it's still a trip when I go to see the film. When I got to see the film in theaters, you know, this summer, like it was an out of body experience for me to just like kind of hear that. I'm like, whoa, okay, I wrote those words. That's crazy. A lot of things have changed since then, but that's still there more or less. But yeah, so that was the idea. And then as we continue to talk about it, you know, I started talking about what I was doing. I was sending him pages, and he was like giving me feedback on like how he was feeling it. And at some point, I think I just at one point used the word, like when I was describing it, like Hollywood, I was like, I might have used the word Titan or something. And that just seemed for Yannick to really spark this idea that like pretty quickly developed into this thing where it's like, there's like 3 types of Hollywood. There's the Titans, the weirdos, and the dreamers. And as we talked about like what we thought that meant, I was like, okay, I think I can work with this. So then the mission became, let's divide this thing into 3 structures. So at that point, there's still not really characters. Like, I think the only thing we had something that was like could be a quote character is as Yannick was like, because Yannick was basically, even as I was doing these very early pages, he was already going out there and like putting his VR camera in like little spots and like kind of just experimenting with that and like editing footage. I'm sure you kind of talked about this. Like, this is a film that in some ways was being edited even in pre-production, you know? So so he comes out and he's like, well, there's this one guy that Yannick knew, I don't know how they originally met, named Barry, who's in the film as Barry. And he was like, yeah, this guy's a very interesting character. He reminds me so much of this other character of the screenplay he had already written at that point. So it was like this weird coincidence where like, wow, you're just like this character I wrote. So they kind of struck up a friendship over that. And he was like, I think it'd be cool if we just like have Barry in the film here and there. And like, then it was like, oh, maybe Barry is like a dreamer. So that was like kind of the first sort of idea of like, oh, maybe these ideas, this Titans, Weirdos, Dreamers concept could be kind of like embodied by people. But it was still hard to figure out how to do that in VR with the way we were talking about it. So that's more or less how far we got with it at the time, because Yannick was just like, okay, he was starting to feel more and more ambivalent about this VR process, I think because he was shooting stuff. He's like, I don't know how this will really work. I like this narration you wrote, but, like, I don't know what we're really going to do with it. So we kind of just, like, put it in the backdrop for a few months. And Yannick went on to work on some other things, and around this time, he started working with Chris Blim on another project, and they were developing it like, I want to do this like where, because you're an actor, like Yannick and Blim were basically writing this script together, and they were like, we're going to shoot this, you'll star in it, and we'll get some of our other friends to be in it. And so they were working on that, and I think at some point after like months of working on that, it was like, I don't know if I want to do this particular story. Maybe there's like a little bit too much of a weightiness to what they were trying, or I don't know exactly how they hashed it out. Fast forward then another couple weeks later, they're still kind of, because they're friends, like they're like hanging out, and it's like they developed this other character sort of that basically became what will become Boyle, and they started just writing stuff with that. And I think maybe Yannick shared with him the idea of Mondo, or the original Mondo Hollywood film with Blim, and it became like, let's make that, but like instead of it this being this VR project, let's make it a film. And I don't know at what point it then transitioned to this. Let's make this a film that we're actually just shooting on an iPhone. I think it might have started. Yannick would be able to better tell this part of the story, but I assume it started with this like, I'm just have my iPhone. I'm just gonna start shooting you doing stuff, and like kind of almost like rehearsing this character. So then around that same time too, there's a couple other friends of ours that were actors they started kind of doing the same thing with. And then very quickly it developed into, all right, we're making Mondo Hollywood land. Mondo Hollywood land. We're shooting it on iPhone. This friend of ours is in it, this friend of ours is in it, this friend of ours is in it. They kind of all have their own separate little characters I've been developing with them. I'm going to be shooting it. I was like, but I still want to use your narration. I still want, like, the Titans, Weirdos, Dreamers. I still want this whole grandiose, like, story of the guy in the fifth dimension. So I was like, uh-huh. It's like, so can you make that work? I was like, oh, what? Can I make that work? So in other words, he was asking me to basically write a script from footage he was already shooting, tying it into this other thing they would work with that was supposed to be for VR. And, like, because he, at no point even after he asked me to do that, him and Chris Blim, who he's also writing pages with on the material they were working on, like, at no point, like, was they stopping. So, in other words, I would get new scenes or new pages that they had written, and then it was, like, being tossed to me, like, can you figure out how this kind of fits in the structure, or where the narrator comes in? It was very messy for a few months, and, like I'll say, very, very messy. But I think as he started adding more characters and more friends into the cast and stuff, developing different ideas that he wanted to do, and started being like, okay, maybe this character's weirdo, maybe this character's a dreamer, maybe this character's a Titan. It started to be like, all right, let's actually sit down and try to like piece this together. So that's around the time me, Yannick, and Chris Blim all started getting together and like really trying to figure out how to structure this. And like the first attempt at this, and like I said, Yannick was already editing footage, so he had whole sequences cut, some of which did not make it into the film. Quite a few of which, some of them are like the sequence where Boyle is at that protest. Like, we shot that during the March of Our Lives protest in Los Angeles. This would have been like March or something, 2018. Like, that was shot, that sequence was cut, and there were things added to the front end of it, very complicated things actually. But that sequence, the core of it more or less stayed the same for months, like after other things were added to it. So I would take the sequences that he had cut together, that he was showing me, plus pages he was giving me, plus stuff from the day, like dailies, and then just was like kind of puzzle piecing it all together at different points. And really then we got to a point where we were like, okay, I think we have a lot of pieces. Some pieces still needed to be reshaped, some pieces still needed to be pruned. There was whole storylines that were aborted, whole characters that were completely changed. But he was like, we need an ending. I tell this part of the story in particular because, you know, this to me was like the part that I personally have the most pride about. But like, honestly, the part of what gives me the pride is like what Yannick was able to do with it as the director and what the cast was able to do with it. I kind of wrote this as the challenge. And what I'm talking about is the sort of endings climax, which I call a heist. I mean, it is a heist as far as I'm concerned. And I was like, what if because we were pitching a lot of different ideas, and there was just like a lot of back and forth, and it kind of felt like we weren't getting anywhere. And at one point I was just like, yeah, but like, what if we did like an Ocean's 11 style heist with several of the characters? And I pretty quickly like had in mind like what the circumstance that would lead to that was, but it all kind of came together pretty quickly on that. And then they shot it, and then it was cut. And when I finally saw the thing, I was like, all right, if nothing else in this movie works, I think this is pretty goddamn cool. So, because it is a film shot on an iPhone. So all that with that said, I think to me, like where I look back on Mondo Hollywoodland now is that like it's so surreal for me to just kind of see the journey of how it came across. And I think if there's anything that listeners of your show and people interested in independent film, specifically if they're interested in making independent film, should kind of take away from it is like, oh, there's you don't have to have all the answers right away. Like if you just stick with something, even if it morphs and changes like a million times, it can be really worthwhile. It's like it helps though to have like a team. If you're doing it on your own, it can be difficult. But if you have a different set of minds and there's like kind of like conflict, but like good conflict, like conflict that helps you like push yourself to make something really great, that's how you'll get something I think worthwhile. I don't know, do you think that answers the question?
Oh God, that is great. It feels like that right there feels like something you could just tack onto the DVD if you wanted to.
Honestly, well, since I have the recording here, maybe I will.
Oh yeah.
I appreciate that, guys. Thank you.
Yeah, no. Yeah, tap that in with some of the stuff I talked about Yannick about, and like lots of that, yeah.
It's always weird to sit there and listen to somebody's like thought process of how something came together, because I've done this before where like I'm talking about like a project I'm working on, and it kind of like it starts to grow from me having conversations with other people about this project that I'm working on. And that seems like a lot of what's happening here is like, oh, somebody's spitballing ideas here, and then you kind of just like co-opt those, and it kind of grows into something like even bigger and better because of it. Like,
for sure. No, completely. I mean, I think it really taught. I didn't fully register it this way at the time because it's all happening so fast at a certain point. But it really did teach me a lot about like collaboration and like the creative process like over a long period of time. And I didn't even touch on because you know I didn't have as much to do with it necessarily, but I didn't even touch on like the process of like editing it once production finally did wrap, which was very complicated and something that Yannick really pushed himself incredibly hard on doing, as someone who's like right there in the other room, like could tell, like I was of the perspective. I'll just say this: I was of the perspective like this movie can be 2.5 hours. It can be almost 3 hours because it's like you're telling essentially 7 different character stories in one movie. Like like they each kind of have to breathe, each kind of function, and I was very committed to that. I advocated for that at every step of the way, and like I come to you now, like, and I said this to you after seeing the film in back in August when it premiered or when it opened in LA. We actually had a premiere earlier, but I don't know, it didn't hit me the same way. I think there might have been some additional tweaks even after that, but it really hit me like, no, what he was pushing for really worked out. Where I think the strength of the film a lot of the time comes from the fact that there's like a real sense of propulsion to it, where you're introduced to a new character, and like anytime you do that in a story, you're immediately kind of almost pulling your audience out because they're like, "Who's this? I don't know this person. What do I think of them? You're telling me I have to now hitch my wagon to them? Like, I'm not sure about that." And you immediately, like, usually in every single case, like you go back and check this structurally, like there's a joke or something that kind of really helps get you into the character, and then it's like doubles down, triples down on that pretty quickly, so that like you can be like, okay, I get it. I get what this person's about. I might not have the same opinion about each character, each story, but I'm very at least given something that I can kind of latch onto if I so choose, and that kind of helps carry you through the story and helps make it so like, okay. And that's the thing that I did have something to do with in terms of, because as we were fire. I don't mean like us, like the creative people behind it fighting, though there was a lot of that. I mean like me kind of fighting with the material. As I was kind of fighting my way through it, I kept really trying to come back to this point of like, we need to kind of, if this Titans Weirdos Dreamers concept is really going to play, we need to kind of have multiple characters for each one of those, which we already had an abundance of characters.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, we had to cut some, or just at least trim their existence down a little bit. We have to kind of narrow it basically down to 2, and those 2 will intercut their stories, but we're really kind of leaving them in that piece so that each section kind of stands on its own in some way, and then interspersed through that, and like directly related and spun off from that, is the Boyle story, which kind of treks you through the whole arc. And Boyle is accompanied by this man from the 5th dimension, James Mason voice, essentially. Which, another thing, I don't know what your guys' thoughts were when you see the film, but it was very interesting from my perspective. The amount of, I'll say, thought I attempted to put in there about like how that is supposed to, metaphysically work, like to the whole point, like, you know what I mean? Like, what the level of awareness of his like eye or existence, or how that's supposed to translate into the camera work or other things, like when you hear and when you don't. I think what was developed on that was very compelling, but I also think that where Yannick pushed it to get to in those months and weeks of editing was like, let's par that back as much as possible so that like you get the connection, because the connection between the only real relationship that character has that's a relationship is to Boyle. So let's leave that, but even Boyle's got so much else going on. We'll just check in with him kind of in the beginning, check in with him at the end, and then he'll kind of serve as like an entryway into each of the segments, kind of introducing them. And really, other than that, he's kind of hands off. But, and I say but, that's in terms of narration. I think maybe because when it was shot that wasn't fully conceived, or just because of other choices and stylistic moves, I actually still really appreciate that when you watch the film, if you kind of pay attention to the way the camera work's done, or the way when and if like characters like address the camera and look into the camera, right? Like there is that kind of that sort of language that I was attempting to develop is still very much there. And I think what's cool is like it kind of takes on a new purpose now, because now it just feels like, in a way that's honestly bringing it full circle, more traditionally Mondo, it just kind of feels like that mockumentary kind of thing. Like whether you're watching The Office or whatever, I'm just like, hey, like I'm going to crack an inside joke towards the audience, break the fourth wall, right? So I don't know. I find that interesting that there is there is this whole quote expandable or expanded lore behind like all the stuff in the movie, and I don't know. I've talked to Yannick about the potential to explore that in other material or other things. But for now, the film is the film, and it's like I think it's interesting. I wonder what people might wonder about it if they're at all curious.
Yeah. It's I think a great thing is like like talking about this is like to give like the purpose of this conversation as far as what we're as our general conversation about independent film is to like bring something to the forefront is that a more independent film isn't necessarily a film with like a less of a story and less of thought put behind it, or even like I don't think you can necessarily say
Yeah.
that of like a bad film versus a good film. Lots of not to say Mondo Hollywoodland's bad. It's quite good, but so, like there's like it's important to realize like people are putting a lot of thought between most things. I don't know if like I haven't like looked at like every behind the scenes picture about like every movie, but I don't.
Oh,
I
I'm
think
that
there's
type of guy.
scarcely yeah. I think there's scarcely an example of like a head empty director or and screenwriter team that's just like putting something very basic on the screen, especially if like you're not full on like some certain genres might be accused of that, but even then I don't think it's
Well,
often
if I could
fair enough.
say, because
Yeah.
like
Mm-hmm.
I think given what I was just saying, but like I'll kind of give the not the counterpoint to it, but just kind of like what I think is important to keep in mind for whether you're a filmmaker or someone interested in the process of it, is that it is important, I think, genuinely, to not get too ahead of yourself, like with these things,
Mm-hmm.
because I mean that's kind of like another lesson that I take from it in some ways. I think when we have the sort of triumvirate of myself, Yannick, and Chris Blem as like the key creative team behind this, the three writers on the project. It's like if we're gonna have the diversity of perspective that we're gonna have, I'm obvious from if you know me, or obvious maybe from just listen to me. It makes all the sense in the world that I would be that one advocating for. No, let's dig in this a little deeper. Let's make this a little more complicated. Like let's burst out the seams, and like I don't mind doing that because that's something that I am interested in. Just if I was looking at another film, I'm always like, like for example, when I saw the new Dune movie, and I hadn't really any previous experience with Dune. I mean, I knew of it, but I was immediately like, I'm the type of person who's like, I want to read the book. I want to like literally read everything about this world now. Like if I'm interested in it, I'm interested in it all the way. So I know as that fan or that viewer, that audience member myself, I appreciate when I feel like things are really thought out and planned. At the same time, and this is what I'm saying, like if you don't have a situation where there's a more of like a counterbalance against it, and you have to be that counterbalance for yourself, I definitely advise, especially if you're a screenwriter. The directors and producers will have to kind of come to this themselves, but always start with the script. To me, I'm a guy who's like the script is king. Like really do try to keep things as direct and to the point as possible. I think that is always the way to go. Don't be overly concerned if you have to get an appendix out to understand what the hell's happening. You're not doing your job right? But that being said, I also think that I don't think there's to the point you made. I don't think there's necessarily. It's not about accusing anyone of being empty-headed, but I do think with independent film, and this easily could have been one of them in this way, where we're talking about shooting an iPhone. You're like your concern isn't necessarily how ambitious am I going to make this. Like now, when we make a big budget blockbuster, whether Dune or anything Marvel does, of course the implication is you have to develop this gigantic world because all that is going to be spun off into merch and other material in future sequels. Like I was just alluding to, Mondo has enough to it where if we did have the money or the time or the desire to do that, there's ways we could do that. And in fact, interestingly enough, like Yannick and I have had conversations about doing a comic book because those things, to the benefit of an independent film, like, they can be promotional material in the same way. Like, you don't have to have the big companies do it. Like, there are ways to create, if you know the right artists, and have, and like we were talking to specific comic book shops in LA. Like, there are ways to be like, oh, I'm going to put this out as, like, publish it independently, just like, you know, kind of the same approach we took with the movie, but a different piece of media, and put that out there. And if you are interested in Mondo, or maybe you've never heard or seen the film, but now you see the comic, you like the comic, you enjoy the comic, like, oh, there's a movie? Cool. Like, it can work the same way as it does for those big things, even with smaller things. You just kind of have to be willing to explore the idea, and hopefully you have enough depth there, enough grounding to kind of lend itself to that. I think even, like, the smallest, most intimate dramas, there is some potential there. Like, a film that's coming out this year is The Souvenir 2, Part 2. It's like a sequel to a very, very kind of like hard, like traditional kind of drama. The not type of movie you would think would have a sequel, right? Like, so there is a world now where if you approach your audience, like, I think those films are like released by A24, which I don't know if you guys have thoughts or opinions about, but kind of has like a little bit like a cult behind it at this point, where there are people who just, like, you'll see Facebook groups or Reddit threads. It's like any film released by A24, it almost like is their Marvel. It's kind of like the indie, like overly cinephile version of like a Marvel thing, where it's like, oh, did you see Lamb? I don't know anything about it, but it's A24, so I want to see it. Like, it's it's kind of funny how that works. So I think more people can tap into that in, like, the modern internet age. There's no limit. I mean, I think actually Yannick asked me to kind of create some Reddit content for Mondo. I haven't gotten around to it yet.
Yeah, the internet's weird. It's like, I mean, if you look at the '60s, there's like all types of these weird genres exist, but like the internet's made things like that maybe were perhaps would have been, it could have been trapped in their obscurity, like have that opportunity to be accessed to whoever wants or needs them, which is always a double-edged sword sometimes, obviously, but it's presented like a lot of opportunities, and like, and there's some downsides to this, but like, you have this, a lot of people have this avenue for global, like a more global release, quote unquote, than they ever did. Obviously there's reasons you don't necessarily just put your movie on YouTube, but a guy could do that.
But
it's like it.
Yeah, I would just say it's funny you mentioned that. Like, I agree. I wouldn't put a movie on YouTube, really, but you know, and other things I've worked on or have been working on, but even it doesn't even matter. Like, just even the hypothetical idea of this. I'm someone who, when I look at the field of independent cinema, or like just cinema writ large, I am very, very interested in kind of advocating or pushing towards a much more decentralized model for everything related. Now, there's attempts to do this. I've come across some. I've even been propositioned by some, and you know, the sense I get is that they might have the right idea up until a point, but their intention or their plan of execution doesn't strike me as the right one, and or there's other sort of factors going on in their intentions that are their like ambitions that I don't think actually square with what I would be partial to. But that putting that aside, I just think that I would love to live in a world where if Mondo inspires people to do this, as we obviously want it to be like, no, go out and shoot a movie on your cell phone. It kind of all comes back to this Francis Ford Coppola quote, which I haven't even mentioned. I have a podcast of my own. It's called Cinphomaniac. I'll give it a more full plug later, but I'll just say that, like, one of the things I did, because one of the intentions or ideas I had with the podcast early on was I wanted it to be kind of more similar to kind of what you guys are doing, where you bring on independent filmmakers and stuff. We haven't really done that yet. It's kind of developed into more of a critical analysis of films show, which I'm very proud of that. But I'm kind of hoping to kind of marry the two at some point, just like when the situation is a little different, and I'm able to maybe have a studio space and bring people in live. Like, that's kind of what I'm hoping to do at some point. And the reason to do that is because I really do believe in that message I was talking about. So there's this very, very, very famous quote that Yannick and I both love. I don't know if you talked about Francis Ford Coppola.
I believe he did, but go ahead.
Yes, I think you already know where I'm going with this. Yeah, he did. Yeah, so he's a big stan of him, and at the end of Hearts of Darkness, the documentary about the making of Apocalypse Now, he's sitting like in his vineyard or whatever, and he's giving an interview, and he's talking about how this is again in like 1990, 1991, so there's no phones yet. It's just like he's just amazed that we even have probably at that time were like VHS camcorders, and he's like, now some little girl can just go make a movie like in the middle of America. She can just take her father's camera and make a movie. And that's the future. She could be the next Mozart. And so I use that as kind of like our part of our sound drop for the intro of my podcast. And what I'm trying to suggest there is that to me, that still holds. That still is the future that I want to see. And it's not just about the quote, like means of production here. It's not just about like what equipment you're using or how that's being organized. At least from that point of view, it's about saying, look, we could. I don't want to get too far afield with my specific ideas. I don't think it's the right forum for it. Maybe if you have me back on, we can talk about this specifically. But I have thought about what I think a decentralized future of filmmaking would actually look like, the version that I would want to exist.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very interesting because you could really have something where you could potentially make really big, complicated movies without studios, without even the kind of independent financing model we have now, where it's like you get all this outside investment and there's complications that come with that, pre-selling to foreign markets, all this stuff that kind of, not always, the way it's worked out, thankfully, a lot of the time is there is a degree of, within a certain budget range, like creative freedom given to the filmmakers, but it's not always great the way it's made. I mean, I don't know if we want to talk about it here at all, but obviously there's been some situations that have emerged in the last week or two that really show you about the types of things that can go wrong on a film set, and so like you have to watch out for that. So I think that part of what the model that I'm interested in would be also, it would do all the above at the same time, kind of like it would give new avenues to create films without the need of that traditional finance apparatus. It would allow people creative freedom, but it would also have better, working conditions for the people that actually work and make the films, and giving them better, involvement or equity in the project itself and all that. So if we can get to that future, and I think the way I look at it is, I'm making my movies right now, but I have this podcast, but what I'm really hoping to one day aspire to is a position where I could help kind of in some way, either big or small, realize a future that actually looks like this. So yeah, that's kind of like where I come from, and if I think we get to that point, the whole game will be changed.
Cody, did you have some? I think we cut you off.
I was gonna talk earlier about like the idea of how cult cinema kind of affects so for how mainstream media kind of affects cult cinema in the long run. I think a couple of things that you've even brought up earlier about this classic movie, Mondo Hollywoodland, or Mondo Hollywood, how it shaped what Mondo Hollywoodland became. Like, we've brought on a couple of obscure popcorn flicks from like the 1980s. I think Mono's Hands of Fate was a really good idea of that, and this guy took a bet from his friend that he could make a movie or something for like $20,000, so he went out on a limb and he wrote this movie called Manos Hands of Fate, which is an atrocity in my opinion, but
I've
it's
not seen this. I think I've heard whispers about it somewhere once upon a time, but yeah,
it's one of the iconic Mystery Science Theater 3000 episodes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, the guy had taken a bet to make the movie and shot it with like a bunch of some Texas like theater group had like helped them shoot it, and he filmed it on. This is another thing that we like. You guys are filming your film on iPhone. This guy had to film a film on something that could not record more than 45 seconds of audio
Oh my god.
or 45 seconds of video, and
Oh,
like,
don't get me wrong. We have it easy now. That's that.
oh
I'm
yeah,
well aware.
so much of it. So much of it, like this guy would like look at this and be like, "Oh my god, it's so jealous, anger."
Yeah, well, I mean, I wouldn't say I know because I still had some benefit of like digital tools, but like I've made films on Super 8 and other film mediums and just like used vintage equipment on things, and it's fun. You're like excited to do it, but you immediately are like, oh my god, like there was no other way of doing this, and in fact, even again, that way is still enhanced by access to editing on your laptop and etc. Right? Like so
Yeah.
there's a big difference there, and I always appreciate when I see the vintage filmmaking going on, especially done whether it's by kids or people like
Yeah.
in the film I saw last night, Licorice Pizza, or like if you've seen that J.J. Abrams movie Super 8, or any number of things when you see the kids like, oh, someone had to really do actually basically be a grip and hold these very hot lights because you cannot expose that film without some heavy assistance, right? So
Yeah.
it's always funny. And you know what? The other thing that what you're just saying, bro, you mentioned the history of science theater. I like Yannick's a big fan. I don't know if it's fair to say he's a fan of the filmmaker himself, but of course he is. But like I don't know if he talked about it. Like when we talk about the Tim Burton film Ed Wood about Ed Wood, is always an
Yeah.
inspiration. I know he takes very seriously, and I do too in my own way. But I think like Yannick has a very earnest quality about him, and I think he definitely responds to the earnestness of the Ed Wood character, the Ed Wood person, in terms of just like, I don't care what other people say. I am pursuing my dream. I'm going to make these films, and you see a very similar thing with another film, which is kind of like, to my mind, like the quote modern cult film is The Room, right? Like when I look at what Tom Wiseau does or did when he made that film, and he's made other films since. That might be an interesting episode for you guys if you haven't done one
Yeah.
already. Is like just the like other films of Tom Wiseau or films that he like acts in, where I'm like, what? He like in some other movie with Greg Sestero, and it's like I remember the trailer for it dropping like a few years ago, like around the time the Disaster Artist movie was coming out, and I was like, oh man, it's like more of this, more of this. It still goes on. He's still the same guy with his sunglasses and long hair, and it's I'd love that spirit of like just kind of being like, if no one else like it doesn't matter like if people are quote like throwing popcorn at the screen. I mean, another kind of cult movie example or classic that I've experienced with it. I mean, everyone does, I think, or a lot of people do. Is I remember the first time I ever went to one of those Rocky Horror Picture Show screenings where people are like throwing bread and popcorn and stuff at the screen, and it's all very like it's a people have done this so many times that there's like very specific like rehearsed rituals that happen at very specific moments in the film, and like if you're experiencing it for the first time, you're like, wait, this is what I do now, okay. And I would talk about that sometimes with Yannick with regards to Mondo, because we'll see what, like, it's weird now because we're in this pandemic world and streaming. Like we had a small theatrical exhibition go on in Los Angeles in August, but I'm really looking forward to a potential future here, especially if we are able to really continue to get it out there and continue to promote it. Like we're kind of looking at this is the job from now and forever. Like I'll come on this podcast and mention it 20 more times if you want, if you'll have me. Because I want people to find it, see it, so that like one day in the not too far future we can go on tour with it and bring it in theaters. Because I think the theatrical experience, honestly, when you get a big group of people, that's where the sort of quote cult really comes alive, right? And it doesn't have to be like, oh, people are throwing stuff at it. I don't care. Throw whatever you want. Like to me, especially, you can't call a movie Mondo anything and not be open to that as far as I'm concerned. I don't know. Maybe Yannick feels a little differently about it as the director and who takes it very seriously. But I'm like, nah. Like, every time the character Ted, who's played by our friend Alex Loinez, he every time like he makes a euphemism for cocaine, like someone should throw something at it. I don't care. Like, I'll be all for it, or make a holler.
Just make a drinking game to the idea of Mondo Hollywoodland.
Oh,
Everybody
the
takes
Mondo
a shot when
drinking
somebody.
game. Yeah, absolutely. I could.
That's not a thing.
Plan out rules for that right now. But see, that's the thing. It's like, I don't want me to be the one to do it. I want real fans to do it. Real like that's the goal. But I definitely, if anyone wants suggestions on that, I can maybe provide that.
And I mean, honestly, I've been staring slowly at this Google search page. You guys have like a 92% rating on Rotten Tomatoes.
We do. We're very proud of this.
I don't know.
It's out right now. That's cool.
Yeah, it's really cool. I mean, and all credit to Yannick, because he really pushed it to get as many reviews written up about it as he can. And we were actually at 100% for a minute, and like in a weird way, we were both like, I'm glad it's down to 92. We don't need to be kind of coming in with that kind of like 100%, because then it is like people will just be like, it'll give them a reason to be like, it's not that good, I don't want to provoke that. Yeah. Oh, don't get me started on it.
Rotten Tomatoes is a thing I've talked about. Yeah, the like 100% thing is like how they get it. I'm pretty sure is like they take like general approval and like average it with review scores, and like that's like a recipe for kind of disaster, because I've talked about this before, but like it either inflates a film or deflates a film, which, but like, say what you will, there's good and bad about that, but it can be really rough on like some films that aren't doing so well if like the critics are giving them like a 7, but they don't really like them, and so it drags the score down to like a 60 or a 50, and that can be pretty rough on some people.
I mean, that's the thing, that magic 60% number. Once you get below that, all of a sudden your whole fate changes. But I think people are so hyper aware of it that like, if you're not, I feel like now people like it might be below 60 is rotten, but now like in people's minds, if you're below 80, you're like, you must not be that good, or like below 70 at least. Like, there's it's very silly, because you still talk to people and you get the impression that a lot of people don't understand what like an aggregate score actually means.
Yeah.
Like, there's a lot of sort of misconception, or even if they do, it's like they functionally don't. Like, they act as if it's like somehow like God's seal or something. I don't know.
Yeah, no, and I talk, me and Cody would talk about like aggregate scores on the show sometimes, and usually, and like, I don't know, usually it like results in like us being like, oh, that's kind of lower than it should be, or yeah, that seems a bit inflated, which is like what I just said. It's kind of like a weird exercise, which I don't know. We do scores here, so it's one of those things that like we contribute to. We've had this discussion with people, but yeah, it's like that's maybe something to talk about. Like the relationship between like film and reviews, and like it's such a crucial thing, and I feel like sometimes people think it's like more crucial than it is, but because a lot of like, I don't know too many times. Like, there's two things. There's like a movie getting like that really high score and like getting some extra buzz, or like that movie getting this one breakaway review from a reviewer, and then getting other people on board with it.
Yeah, I mean, we had one review that is that actually legit said we were one of the best movies of the year, and I was remember thinking like, oh, I hope people see this and it spreads around so that people really because you're right, it's like kind of people's opinions are obviously, they're impacted by the opinions of people around them. Either they want to kind of echo it, or they feel the pressure to echo it, or they feel the pressure to be contrarian, or however that works. It's like, and it kind of works like a it's a momentum thing.
It's definitely so much different being on the other side, aside of the like, instead of being the person whose movie's getting reviewed, you're the person doing the reviewing.
Yeah.
Sometimes, like we've given movies scores that probably deserved higher, or movies that definitely didn't deserve what we gave them, or somewhere in between. So, like, you have skin in the game, is what I'm saying.
Oh, yeah, it's
Yeah.
true. I definitely do.
Eh,
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
yeah. Yeah. There are some people that just like can't just break under the pressure. I think I saw one really dumbly hilarious one the other week where the guy was made this. He got like an article with the fucking Times and was just like, "Oh, novelists isn't like a men's game anymore." And they look up and like I saw the Twitter thread and it like pointed to like his like his writing, and it was just like some of the worst erotic literature I've ever seen.
Oh,
Like
goodness.
I I don't like I watched it and like I never thought it would be like, I don't think this man has ever come to orgasm. I don't think he knows how that works, which is the weirdest statement.
Well, I
But
mean, it definitely plays into the type of like a very stiff kind of like overly editorialized kind of writer for sure. I can totally see that.
I've got something a little bit more general now, like, because you said that you started your own podcast, which is
Yeah,
cool.
yeah.
Everybody should have a podcast. I think it's weirdly popular. Like, how
I'm
does
glad you feel that way, Cody.
how
That's actually nice to hear.
how does it differ coming in, like, talking on as a podcaster, talking about movies, and how, I don't know if you've done
Yeah.
reviews on movies, or the
No,
because
that's the main focus. But so the thing is, to answer your question, it's interesting. I I started working on my podcast about 11 months ago, but we only started releasing episodes in July.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been 7 months since then, and I'm very proud of the work that we've done so far. I'm still kind of like I have a co-host, Dana
Mm-hmm.
Della Garza, and we had to kind of like really kind of work it out so we have some miles. Because I'm a big podcast listener, so I have a very kind of like high bar in my head of like what I want our show to be, or the show that I feel like represents me at like what I most want to kind of communicate. So I really put the focus on that, and I feel like we're now in a very good place. But now it's like, okay, let me get some of the technicals right. But to more directly answer your question, I feel as though I'm much more comfortable kind of doing this, like having you guys ask me questions, than I would have been before I started doing my own show. Because now I'm just so used to hearing myself talk a lot that like I'm just like it's second nature. I guess I could do that socially in real life, but I found when I first sat down to finally start recording, this is why it took a few months before I started releasing episodes. I was like, this is a whole different set of muscles. Like I could feel myself getting fatigued in a way very quickly. And just like, I was like, that's not going to make a good show if all of a sudden I sound half dead about 20 minutes in. So I had to work on that. Now I feel very comfortable with it. And so in a weird way, it's interesting to be on the other side because I'm still able to use those muscles, but it's also like, oh, but I can kind of relax a little bit more because I don't have to do all the work.
So
Yeah.
what I was asking, do you think you cut people a little bit more slack when doing like movie reviews if you know what's going on the other side of the industry, right?
Very
Not
good question.
necessarily like as a person who's watching a movie, but somebody who's done work within the movie industry. How does your process change, and how does that affect how you view a film that's been made? And
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question, actually. And it's something that I do think about quite a bit. So, this is the thing. I'm of two minds about it. So, where I really stand is like me kind of just figuring out the navigation line that I want to draw between these 2 points. It's not so much, let me just say, it's not so much that like, oh, because I'm on the other side and I've experienced filmmaking that it makes me want to cut slack. I mean, there's that maybe to a degree, because like, I think if anything, and there's been examples of this, the more you understand about how movies are made, the better you are going to be at being able to adequately critique them or understand them. I think there's no doubt about that. So, you know, a great critic or a great reviewer is deeply familiar and experienced with that and thinks a lot about it. They might develop their own kind of perspective on it. It's probably good that they do that feels a little bit outside of that mode. But honestly, my perspective is more, it is that a little bit, but I'm also very keen on process and all that stuff. So it kind of all meshes together. So the way it comes from me is less like, oh, I've been on the inside, so I'm more sympathetic. It's more like I am on the inside, so I want to be sure that what I'm saying is in the spirit to which I can conduct myself as someone on the inside. So what I mean is like, I don't want to be the guy who's like, no, like let's have this kind of very optimistic, forward-looking point of view, and then like when I'm communicating with the crew or communicating with the producers, or I'm developing a project or whatever it is, I'm kind of bringing that approach. But then on the airs, I'm like Mr. Grumps and like just craps on everything because that would make me feel very two-faced, I think, to my own self, and it's not really what I want to be. Now, I'm using an extreme calling myself Mr. Grumps and crap on anything. That's never been my way. Like even kind of like outside of my experience in working in the industry, that's never been my way, because I take criticism very seriously, which can make it feel very dire and very like severe in some cases, but I try to never make it sound too much like that, and it really doesn't feel like that to me. Like what it really more feels like to me is like, I really care about good movies, and I think so many filmmakers and so many films have that potential. So it's like, it's kind of like being a constructive critic, if you will. Like I want to like give the best like foot forward, and that to me is the same way I might be, certainly if not on a set, certainly like when I'm in a writer's room. Like that's what kind of I was getting at before, when I was like, I'm usually the one who's like very pushing, like, no, this could be better. Let's restructure this. Let's like not be afraid to throw out the entire thing and start over, because like it can always be better. Like I am kind of that perfectionist. So it's really more like I want to take that same approach, but speak from the outside, and I don't want there to be an incongruity there. But I also recognize that I, like everybody else, have my biases. So that's really more my concern sometimes. Just like, oh, I can be a little bit too much of a fanboy about this, or I can be maybe a little bit too much of just like a cynic about this, just because I've traditionally never liked it or responded to it. And I have to keep in mind that I might be talking to someone in my audience who doesn't know where I'm coming from at all, or doesn't share any of my preconceived notions. And I want to make sure that if I do say something where I'm like, I don't know about this, or I'm giving like a pretty like, ooh, this was actually like quite offensive or whatever, I want to make sure I'm like giving enough context to kind of hopefully guide people along. And I think what's most helpful for me in that regard is my co-host, because my co-host has got a very different kind of demeanor to myself. Like she is kind of like just a very strong optimist. I think that shines through to anyone who listens to it. And so like, when I do, like, it's actually fun, because like the good place we've gotten to is like, she almost like, because she knows I can be a little more harsh, she's almost like giddy and excited to hear me throw the hammer. It actually ends up making me look good when I'm like, no, I actually like that. And it's like, oh, really? It ends up making me look like I'm actually pretty reasoned and measured, which is how I want to come across. So I think if I could give anyone any advice on that, it's, one, have a co-host that kind of comes at a different, from a different perspective or different tempo. And then two, just try to keep your audience in mind. Keep your audience in mind that they don't know, especially when like your critiques are coming from, say, to your point about the insider perspective, like a more inside place where like oh, I kind of know some background about that deal, or I kind of know something about like that creative process that might not be common knowledge. Like, let me make sure I'm like explaining that, and if it's something personal or something I wouldn't say over the air, like at least let me give something to kind of account for it so that people are able to follow along why I'm saying what I'm saying, right?
All right. Well, I think that's a good talk. I think we're good to go. You want to give them your whole thing, Marcus, and then
Yeah, thank you so
yeah.
much. I appreciate it. This has been fantastic, guys. I've really enjoyed doing this. I would be more than happy to come on again if you'd have me. And again, when I start reconfiguring my show to kind of be a little more guest oriented, I would definitely love to have you guys come on as well. That would be cool. So yeah, my name is Marcus Hart. I am the co-host of a podcast called Cinphomaniac. You can find us pretty easily. We have a website, cinphomaniac.buzzsprout.com, where you have the links to us on all our podcast services: Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, Amazon, etc. And obviously, of course, if you just search in any of those services, Cinphomaniac, you will find us. We have a YouTube, which I highly recommend because you get the podcast, but you also get a couple of other extras. And I don't know, I've been trying to make it as visual as possible. It's difficult because we're not doing video, so it's just more like using clips of the film and etc. So we have that, and you can also follow us on Instagram with Cinphomaniac _ the podcast on Instagram. Please give us a follow, and I post updates and stuff related to the podcast, and just it kind of gives you a more visual side of the whole thing. But yeah, that's the podcast. And of course, the film Mondo Hollywoodland, which we talked quite a bit about. Like I said, you can find it on Amazon for rental and for streaming, and it's now available in Canada. So if you're a Canadian listener, please check us out, Mondo Hollywoodland. It's a great film. You won't regret watching it. I certainly hope.
Yeah, and you can find us on. I'll put like links in the description. You can find our YouTube at Kyle and Cody's called Cinemacast. Sorry, the uploads have been slow a little late. As of late, my internet is garbage. Yeah, yeah. No, my living a mile from cows living ass. Yeah. This is surreal. Like you had a cop car fly by your house, your apartment a little earlier.
Yes,
I have cows sitting like a mile from me. Yeah. It's just the total dissonance like our situations. But YouTube on Kyle and Cody's called Cinemacast. You can follow the Facebook at Kyle and Cody's called Cinemacast. That's what we got. We also got an Instagram. Don't use it too much, but check out Marcus's anyway. And see you guys pretty soon. We got a lot of cool stuff for November planned. See you guys soon. Goodbye.